Good morning. Okay, it has been a little bit, but we're going to continue on with the hiding place. And this morning or today, whatever the case may be, wherever you are, it is I'm doing chapter 12, and the title of which is Vught. Vught. And we'll find out what that means here in a minute. So just know, Vught is how you say it. Get your things together. Get ready to evacuate. Collect all possessions in pillowcases. The shouts of the guards echoed up and down the long corridor. I stood in the center of my cell in a frenzy of excitement. Evacuate? Then something was happening. We were leaving the prison. The counter-invasion must have begun. I snatched the pillowcase from the little wad of straw I had stuffed into it. What riches this coarse bit of muslin had been in the 2 weeks since it had been provided. A shield for my head from my scratch and the smell of the bedding. It almost didn't matter that the promised sheets had never arrived. With trembling hands, I dropped my few belongings into it. The blue sweater, the pajamas, covered now, back and front, with embroidered figures, toothbrush, comb, a few remaining crackers wrapped in toilet paper. My Bible was in its pouch on my back, where it remained, except when I was reading it. I put on my coat and hat and stood at the iron door, clutching the pillowcase in both hands. It was still early in the morning. The tin breakfast plates had not yet been removed from the shelf in the door. Getting ready had taken no time at all. An hour passed. I sat on the cot. 2 hours. 3. It was warm in the cell this late June day. I took off my hat and coat and folded them next to me on the cot. More time passed. I kept my eyes on the ant hole, hoping for a last visit from my small friends, but they did not appear. Probably I had frightened them by my early dashing about. I reached into the pillowcase, took one of the crackers, and crumbled it about the little crack. No ants. They were staying safely hidden. And suddenly I realized that this too was a message, a last wordless communication among neighbors. For I too had a hiding place when things were bad. Jesus was this place, the rock cleft for me. I pressed a finger into the tiny crevice. The afternoon sun appeared on the wall and moved slowly across the cell. And then all at once there was a clanging out in the corridor. Doors scraped, bolts banged. Out! Schnell! All out! No talking! I snatched up my hat and coat. From my door screeched open. 4 ranks of 5. The guard was already in the next cell. I stepped out into the hall. It was jammed from wall to wall. I had never dreamed so many women occupied this corridor. We exchanged looks. Invasion. We mouthed silently, the soundless words sweeping through the massed women like an electric charge. Surely the invasion of Holland had begun. Why else would they be emptying the prison? Where would we be taken? Where were we headed? Not into Germany. Dear Jesus, not Germany. The command was given and we shuffled forward down the long, chilly halls, each carrying a pillowcase, with her belongings forming a little bulge at the bottom. At last we emerged into the wide courtyard inside the front gate of the prison, and another long wait began. But this wait was pleasant with the late afternoon sun on our backs. Far to the right I could see the columns of the men's section, but crane my neck though I would, I could not see Betsy anywhere. At last the huge gate swung in and a convoy of gray transport buses drove through. I was herded aboard the third one. The seats had been removed, the windows painted over. The bus lurched dreadfully as it started up, but we were standing too close together to fall. When the bus ground to a stop, we were at a freight yard somewhere on the outskirts of the city. Again, we were formed into ranks. The guards' voices were tense and shrill. We had to keep our heads facing forward, eyes front. Behind us, we could hear buses arriving, then lumbering away again. It was still light, but I knew by the ache in my stomach that it was long past supper time. And then, ahead to the left of me, in the newest group of arriving prisoners, I spotted a chestnut bun. Betsy! Somehow, some way, I was going to get to her. Now, instead of wanting the day to end, I prayed that we would stay where we were until dark. Slowly, the June day faded. Thunder rumbled, and a few drops of rain fell. At last, a long row of unlit coaches rolled slowly over the tracks in front of us. They banged to a stop, rolled forward a little farther, then stopped again. After a while, they began backing. For an hour or more, the train switched back and forth. By the time the order came to board, it was pitch dark. The ranks of prisoners surged forward. Behind us, the guards shouted and cursed. Obviously, they were nervous at transporting so many prisoners at one time. I wriggled and shoved to the left. Elbows and shoulders were in my way, but I squirmed past. At the very steps of the train, I reached out and seized Betsy's hand. Together we climbed onto the train. Together found seats in a crowded compartment. Together wept tears of gratitude. The 4 months in Scheveningen had been our first separation in 53 years. It seemed to me that I could not bear whatever happened, that I could bear whatever happened with Betsy beside me. More hours passed as the loaded train sat on the siding. For us, they flew. There was so much to share. Betsy told me about each of her cellmates, and I told her about mine and the little hole into which they scrambled at an emergency. As always, Betsy had given to others everything that she had. The Bible that Nolly had smuggled to her she had torn up and passed around, book by book. It must have been 2 or 3 in the morning that the train at last began to move. We pressed our faces to the glass, but no lights showed, and clouds covered the moon. The thought uppermost in every mind was, is it Germany? At one point, we made out a tower that Betsy was sure was the cathedral at Delft. An hour or more later, the clack of the train changed to pitch. We were crossing a trestle, but a very long one. As the minutes passed and still we had not reached the other side, Betsy and I exchanged looks. The Moerdijk Bridge. Then we were headed south, not east into Germany, but south to Brabant. For the second time that night, we wept tears of joy. I leaned my head back against the wooden slats of the seat and shut my eyes, reliving another train trip to Brabant. Mama's hand had gripped Father's, then, as the train swayed. Then, too, it was June, the June of the first sermon of the garden back of the manse of Caro. I must have fallen asleep back in that other June, for when I opened my eyes, the train had stopped. Voices were shouting at us to move. Schneller! Aber schneller! An eerie glare lit the windows. Betsy and I stumbled after the others along the aisle and down the iron steps. We seemed to have stopped in the middle of a woods. Floodlights mounted in trees lit a broad, rough-cleared path lined by soldiers with leveled guns. Spurred by the shouts of the guards, Betsy and I started up the path between the gun barrels. Schneller! Close ranks! Keep up! 5 abreast! Betsy's breath was coming short and hard, and still they yelled at us to go faster. It had rained hard here, for there were deep puddles in the path. Ahead of us, a white-haired woman stepped to the side to avoid one. A soldier struck her in the back with a gun butt. I took Betsy's pillowcase along with mine, hooked my other arm through hers, and hauled her along beside me. The nightmare march lasted a mile or more. At last we came to a barbed wire fence surrounding a row of wooden barracks. There were no beds in the one we entered, only long tables with backless benches pulled up to them. Betsy and I collapsed onto one of these. Under my arm I could feel the irregular flutter of her heart. We fell into an exhausted sleep, our heads on the table. The sun was streaming through the barrack windows when we woke up. We were thirsty and hungry. We had had nothing to eat or drink since the early meal at Scheveningen the morning before. But all that day no guard or any official person appeared inside the barracks. At last, when the sun was low in the sky, a prisoner crew arrived with a great vat of some thick, steamy substance that we gobbled ravenously. And so began our stay in this place that, we learned, was named Vught, after the nearest small village. Unlike Scheveningen, which had been a regular Dutch prison, Vught had been constructed by the occupation, especially as a concentration camp for political prisoners. We were not yet in the camp proper, but in a kind of quarantine compound outside. Our biggest problem was idleness, wedged together as we were around the long rows of tables with nothing to do. We were guarded by the same young women who had patrolled the corridors at Scheveningen. They had been adequate enough as long as we were behind locked doors. Here they seemed at a loss. Their only technique for maintaining discipline was to shriek obscenities and hand out punishments to all alike. Half rations for the entire barracks, an extra roll call at rigid attention, a ban on talking for 24 hours. Only one of our overseers never threatened or raised her voice. This was the tall, silent head matron from Scheveningen. She appeared in Vught the third morning during the pre-dawn roll call. At once something like order seized our rebellious and untidy ranks. Lines straightened, hands were clamped to sides, whispers ceased as these cold blue eyes swept across us. Among ourselves we nicknamed her the General. During one long roll call, a pregnant woman at our table slumped to the floor, striking her head against the edge of the bench. The General did not so much as pause in her expressionless reading of names. We had been in this outer camp at Vught almost 2 weeks when Betsy and I, along with a dozen others, were called out by name during the morning roll call. When the rest had been dismissed, the General distributed typewritten forms among us and instructed us to present them at the administration barracks at 9. A worker on the food crew, a long-term prisoner from the main camp, smiled encouragingly as he ladled out our breakfast. "Free," he whispered. "Those pink forms mean release." Betsy and I stared disbelievingly at the sheets of paper in our hands. Free? Free to leave? Free to go home? Others crowded around, congratulating us, embracing us. The women from Betsy's cell at Scheveningen wept unabashedly. How cruel to have to leave all these behind. "Surely the war will be over very soon," we told them. We emptied our pillowcases, passing out our few belongings among those who had to stay. Long before 9, we were standing in the big wooden anteroom of administration. At last we were summoned to an inner office where our forms were examined, stamped, and handed over to a guard. We followed this man down a corridor into another office. For hours the process continued as we were shuffled from one room and official to another, questioned, fingerprinted, sent on to the next post. The group of prisoners grew until there were 40 or 50 of us standing in line beside a high anchor chain fence topped with barbed wire. On the other side of the fence was a white birch woods. Above our heads the blue Brabant sky. We too belonged to that wide, free world. The next barracks we entered held a row of desks, with women clerks seated behind them. At one of these I was handed a brown paper envelope. I emptied it into my hand, and the next moment was staring in disbelief at my Alpina watch, Mamma's ring, even my paper guilders. I had not seen these things since the night we had arrived at Scheveningen. Money! Why, that belonged to the world of shops and trolley cars. We could go to a train station with this money. 2 fares to Haarlem, please. We marched along a path between twisted rolls of barbed wire and through a wide gate into a compound of tin-roofed barracks. There were more lines, more waits, more shuffling from desk to desk, but already the camp and its procedures had become unreal to me. Then we were standing before a high counter, and a young male clerk was saying, "Leave all personal effects at the window marked say." But they just gave them back to me. Watches, purses, jewelry. Mechanically, like a machine with no will of its own, I handed watch, ring, and money through the small barred window. A uniformed woman swept them into a metal box. "Move along! Next!" Then we were not to be released. Outside this building, a florid-faced officer formed us into a double column and marched us across a broad parade ground. At one end of it, a crew of men with shaved heads and striped overalls were digging a ditch. What did it mean? What did any of it mean? This whole long day of lines and waits? Betsy's face was gray with weariness, and she stumbled as we marched. Through another fence we arrived in a yard surrounded on 3 sides by low concrete buildings. A young woman in a military cape was waiting for us. "Prisoners, halt!" barked the red-faced officer. "Explain to the newcomers, Fräulein, the function of the bunkers." "The bunkers," the girl began in a bored voice of the museum guide, "are not for the accommodation of those who fail to cooperate with camp rules. The rooms are cozy, if a bit small, about the size of a gym locker. To hasten the educational process, the hands are tied above the head." Even as the horrid recital continued, 2 guards came out of the bunkers, carrying between them the form of a man. He was alive, for his legs were moving, but he seemed to have no conscious control over them. His eyes were sunken and rolled back in his head. "Not everyone," the girl observed in the same detached drawl, "seems to appreciate the accommodations at the bunkers." I seized Betsy's arm as the command to march came again, more to steady myself than her. It was father's train case once again. Such cruelty was too much to grasp, too much to bear. Heavenly Father, carry it for me. We followed the officer down a wide street lined with barracks on either side and halted at one of the gray, featureless sheds. It was the end of the long day of standing, waiting, hoping. We had simply arrived at the main camp at Vught. The barracks appeared almost identical with the one we had left this morning, except that this one was furnished with bunks as well as tables and benches. And still we were not allowed to sit. There was a last wait while the matron was, with maddening deliberateness, checked off our documents against a list. "Betsy," I wailed, "how long will it take?" "Perhaps a long, long time. Perhaps many years. But what better way could there be to spend our lives?" I turned to stare at her. "Whatever are you talking about?" "These young women. That girl back at the bunkers. Corey, if people can be taught to hate, they can be taught to love. We must find a way, you and I, no matter how long it takes." She went on, almost forgetting in her excitement to keep her voice to a whisper, while I slowly took in the fact that she was talking about our guards. I glanced at the matron seated at the desk ahead of us. I saw a gray uniform and a visored hat. Betsy saw a wounded human being. And I wondered, not for the first time, what sort of a person she was, this sister of mine. What kind of road she followed while I trudged beside her on the all too solid earth. A few days later, Betsy and I were called up for work assignments. One glance at Betsy's pallid face and fragile form, and the matron waved her contemptuously back inside the barracks, where the elderly and infirm spent the day sewing prison uniforms. The women's uniform here in Vught was a blue overall with a red stripe down the side of the leg, practical and comfortable, and a welcome change after our own clothes that we had worn since the day of our arrest. Apparently, I looked strong enough for harder work. I was told to report to the Phillips factory. This factory turned out to be no more than another large barracks inside the camp complex. Early in the morning, though it was, the tar beneath the shingled roof was beginning to bubble in the hot July sun. I followed my escort into the single large room where several hundred men and women sat at long plank tables covered with thousands of tiny radio parts. Two officers, one male, one female, were strolling the aisle between the benches while the prisoners bent to their tasks. I was assigned a seat at a bench near the front and given the job of measuring small glass rods and arranging them in piles according to length. It was monotonous work. The heat from the roof pressed like a weight on my head. I longed to exchange at least names and hometowns with my neighbors on either side. But the only sound in the room was the clink of metal parts and the squeak of the officers' boots. They reached the door across from where I sat. "Production was up again last week," the male officer said in German to a tall, slender man with a shaved head and a striped uniform. "You are to be commended for this increase. However, we continue to receive complaints of defective wiring. Quality control must improve." The shaved head man made an apologetic gesture. "If there were more food, Herr Officer," he murmured. "Since the cutback in rations, I see a difference. They grow sleepy. They have trouble concentrating." His voice reminded me of little Willem's, deep cultivated, the German with only a trace of a Dutch accent. "Then you must wake him up. Make them concentrate on the penalties. If the soldiers on the front can fight on half rations, then these lazy—" At a terrible look from the woman officer, he stopped and ran his tongue over his lips. That is, I speak, of course, merely as an example. There's naturally no truth in the rumor that rations at the front are reduced. So, I hold you responsible." And together they stalked from the building. For a moment, the prisoner foreman watched them from the doorway. Slowly, he raised his left hand, then dropped it with a slap to his side. The quiet room exploded. From under the tables appeared writing paper, books, knitting yarn, tins of biscuits. People left their benches and joined little knots of chattering friends all over the room. Half a dozen crowded around me. Who was I? Where was I from? Did I have any news of the war? After perhaps an hour of visiting among the tables, the foreman reminded us that we had a day's quota to meet, and people drifted back to their places. The foreman's name, I learned, was Mormon, and he had been headmaster of a Roman Catholic boys' school. He himself came over to my workbench the third day I was there. He had heard that I had followed the entire assembly line through the barracks, tracing what became of my dull little piles of rods. "You're the first woman worker," he said, "who has ever shown any interest in what we are making here." "I am very interested," I said. "I'm a watchmaker." He stared at me with new interest. "Then I have work for you. I have work you will enjoy more." He took me to the opposite end of the huge shed where the final assembly of relay switches was done. It was intricate and exacting work, though not nearly so hard as watch repair, and Mr. Mormon was right. I enjoyed it, and it helped make the 11th hour workday go faster. Not only to me, but to all the Phillips workers, Mr. Mormon acted more as a kindly older brother than a crew boss. I would watch him ceaselessly moving among his hundreds of charges, counseling, encouraging, finding a simpler job for the weary, a harder one for the restless. We had been at Vught more than a month before I learned that his 20-year-old son had been shot here at the camp the week Betsy and I arrived. No trace of this personal tragedy showed in his care for the rest of us. He stopped frequently at my bench, the first weeks more to check my frame of mind than my work. But eventually his eyes would travel to the row of relay switches in front of me. "Dear watch lady, can you not remember for whom you are working? These radios are for the fighter planes." And reaching across me, he would yank a wire from its housing, or twist a tiny tube from an assembly. "Now solder them back warm. And not so fast. You're over the day's quota, and it's not yet noon." Lunchtime would have been the best time of day if I could have spent it with Betsy. However, Phillips workers were not allowed to leave the factory compound until the workday ended at 6. Prisoners on kitchen detail lugged in great buckets of gruel made of wheat and peas, tasteless but nourishing. Apparently there had been a cutback in rations recently. Still, the food was better and more plentiful than at Scheveningen, where there had been no noonday meal at all. After eating, we were free for a blessed half hour to stroll about within the Phillips compound in the fresh air and the glorious Brabant sun. Most days I found a spot along the fence and stretched out on the warm ground to sleep. The day started with a roll call at 5 a.m. Sweet summer smells came in the breezes from the farms around the camp. Sometimes I would dream that Caro and I were walking hand in hand along a country lane. At 6 in the evening there was another roll call. Then we marched back to our various sleeping barracks. Betsy always stood in the doorway of ours waiting for me. Each evening it was as though a week had passed. There was so much to tell one another. "That Belgian boy and girl at the bench next to mine, this noon they became engaged. Mrs. Irma, whose granddaughter was taken to Germany, today she let me pray with her." One day Betsy's news touched us directly. "A lady from Ermelo was transferred to the sewing detail today. When I introduced myself, she said, 'Another one?' What did she mean? Coy, Do you remember the day we were arrested? A man came to the shop. You were sick, and I had to wake you up. I remembered very well. Remembered the strange roving eyes, the uneasiness in the pit of my stomach that was more than fever. Apparently everyone in Ermelo knew him. He worked with the Gestapo from the first day of occupation. He reported this woman's two brothers for resistance work, and finally herself and her husband too. When Ermelo had finally caught on to him, he had come to Haarlem and teamed up with Willemse and Kaptein. His name was Jan Vogel. Flames of fire leaped around the name in my heart. I thought of father's final hours, alone and confused in a hospital corridor. The underground work so abruptly halted. Wow, lots of pages left. I thought of Mary Italy, arrested while walking down a street, and I knew that if Jan Vogel stood in front of me now, I could kill him. And I'm going to stop chapter 12 right here. We're at a little stopping spot, so now we know what Vught is. It's actually a town in between Holland and Germany. Brabant is to the south in the Netherlands. So until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and grant you peace. Peace.